It's been a really fascinating morning. When Kirby asked me to come and do this, I was happy to do it, and it's been, to be able to share ExxonMobil's energy outlook. But I've learned a lot this morning. I might be the only one in the room that did. Most of you folks already know all this stuff, but seriously, I think it's really great, the program and the interaction, the dialogue, and the educational components. I will say that a couple of our earlier speakers, Ms. Forrester and John, in that first session, did about 2/3 of my presentation, so when you see it, you won't have to work too hard. They've already explained it all. No, seriously, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this presentation into 3 parts. I'm going to talk at the beginning about global demand and the U.S. at an overall level. We heard a little bit about that earlier. I'm going to go into a little bit more in depth in what's driving demand, and that'll let us get into some of the things like where natural gas is used. And then at the end, I want to talk about supply. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So we do this outlook every year. And so later this year, I'm going to have 37 years of experience in the industry, which it's hard to believe, but it's gone by so quickly. We, in our files, actually go back about 75 years to energy outlooks. So I'm only going to be about halfway. And I will say this, the early ones, while they were good analytics, they had terrible graphics. We've overcome that problem now. So we do this outlook by building it up from the bottom up. And the reason we do that is we need to understand what happens in an individual country, because we do business in countries. So we have to do an economic forecast. And I'm not big numbers on these. I'm just going to be more trends and talk about, but let me just tell you what the chart is. And there's a convention here. Blue is the developed economies, red are the expanding economies. So we have to do over 100 economic forecasts for the world. We're in the process of doing the next cycle now. And what this really tells us is over time all economies grow at different paces and at different rates. But the red is growing so quickly that between now and 2040, it's up about 3 times. But more importantly, it's going to be half of the world economic output. Now, earlier we heard the discussion about how much energy demand growth was going to be in the U.S. We actually think it's going to decline slightly. All of the incremental energy demand growth is going to be happening in the developing world, and I'll show you that in a minute. And why is that important? It goes back to this conversation around exports and how energy fits into that. And that's an important part of it. And so this change is going to have a big impact on people. There's roughly 1.5 billion people in the OECD, but there's the rest of the other 7 billion people headed to 9 billion are in the developing economies. So we're going to see a significant amount of growth. I'm not going to drag you through the knothole on those lines on the right, so we'll go to the next chart. What's really important is income in these countries and what it means for standard of living. This is GDP per capita. The little dashed line is where it is in 2010. And the end of the outlook is 2040, and this is income per person. And what it shows is the OECD doubles, roughly. It's actually not quite that good. But China's up 5 times. That's a huge change in economic impact on individuals. And India's up 4 times. And key growth, which is another 10 countries, ranges from 2 to 4 times. So it's a big change in standard of living. We heard about this morning about people who don't cook they cook with dung and other things. Very basic living styles. They do very manual labor, and they often don't have electricity. They may only have it a few hours of the day, and they actually end up moving into much higher standards of living. That is a big change for the world economy, probably an unprecedented change. Let me share a little story with you about the U.S. Now, this is a pretty modern picture, but really, if you go back to the 1850s, 1830s, if you were going to, generally everybody lived on a farm, and they raised their own food, or they raised some food for other people. It took 250 to 300 person hours to harvest a bushel of wheat, 100 bushels of wheat off 5 acres. In 1990, it took 2.5 to 3 hours, and you were able to develop the same 100 bushels of wheat on 3 acres. Technology, energy, new styles, productivity, all those things change. And what's really important is the fact, wow, that's really great, you can do that. Well, you ask yourself, where were the other 99% of those people doing? Well, they moved into industry, service, and other activities, and that's how economies expand. That happened in the U.S. between the mid-1800s and the end of around 2000, and that's what's going on in China and India and other places around the world. And so what that does is it has an impact on the middle class. It's really important to remember that people are the ones who use energy. The economies we live in need energy. But let's understand people. So these little bars on the far left side, there's a short bar at about 2 billion and a high bar at about 4.8. That's the middle class change between 2010 and 2030. Now this is work that we use from the Brookings Institution in Washington. And this is an unprecedented change. The interesting thing is the developed economy middle class stays about the same. Our population really doesn't change. What grows is the middle class in India, in China, and the 10 economies I mentioned a minute ago. I'll let you look at the map. Those 12 economies represent 80% of the increase in the middle class. And what's important with that is these people, they have disposable income and they can make a decision what to do with that last dollar or other dollars. They can buy houses, they can buy cars, they can buy appliances, they can buy better medical care or medical care in the base case or higher education. So these are the middle class of the growing economy. And this is what's really important as it comes to understanding what's driving energy demand growth around the world. For the last decade, we've all thought about China, and China is an important part of that story. So, only another I've got 3 or 4 more charts on this global story just to kind of give you a little more in depth on it. First, energy demand grew about 80% between 1980 and 2010. It's up 35% between 2010 and 2040, and this chart shows total energy demand around the world. Now, if you'll notice the blue in the OECD, you get to about 2015, it starts to trend down. We believe the OECD economies in aggregate are declining in energy demand. Improved efficiency, a number of transitions in fuel mix are driving that. The 12 countries that start out over here, the red, yellow, and purple, grow to 50% of global energy demand by 2050. Now that's not all China. China's energy demand actually slows down and stops growing around 2025 and then actually starts to decline. It's transitioning to other areas. So regardless of where you are involved in the energy space, understanding how we fit into the global energy mix is really important because it is true. It's all interconnected. So if you study energy demand, and we do, and you look at it in 4 ways: electricity generation, industrial demand, transportation, and residential commercial. Those are the 4 basic ways, and there are certain fuels that trend in that. And 40% of the world's energy go into electricity, about 30% into industrial use, about 20% in transportation, and a little over 10% in residential commercial. This is primary fuel. This is not electricity. This is all the primary fuel that you use. That's like gasoline or coal or that. So the point I just made, which is it's all growing in the developing world, this really reinforces that point. So, but this is probably the more interesting chart because it shows you what fuels go there. And every one of those sectors is a little different. So green is oil, red is gas, orange is coal, the dark blue is nuclear, the dark brown is biomass, and the lighter blue is renewables. And so if you look at electricity generation, you pretty much can have all of them. But that's the only place you can really end up with all of them. And the big trend you see there is gas is growing in power generation. We'll come back and talk about that. And the portions at the top don't produce carbon, and they're growing as well. And so you end up with reducing coal in the middle, which has the largest footprint for CO2 emissions in power generation. Move over to industrial demand. Oil and gas captured a lot of the growth there. That's an important part. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, how it plays out. The one thing I'll say about oil really doesn't play much in power gen. It plays in industrial, predominantly in chemicals. Gas grows into chemicals and also rest of industrial processes. Transportation is predominantly a liquid-based environment. Yes, we do believe over time that you will see some electrics penetrate, but not significantly. And because of that, we think transportation fuels remain liquid-based. There will be some penetration of natural gas, though. And on the far right, if you're in the residential commercial area, you see oil and gas making up over time a bit more than 50%. And that brown is that biomass. The comments earlier about dung and wood and charcoal being used in residential commercial environments, that continues to be a significant issue globally. Indoor air pollution is a real problem. So if you stop here and stop talking about the world, what's happening in the U.S.? Well, this chart has 4 lines on it. The top line is our economic output. It doubles between 2010 and 2040. Great performance for the U.S. Our population is up about 20%. Our energy demand is down about 4 or 5%, and our emissions are down 20% or more. So what we end up with is a very interesting set of sort of, I'll call it economic and energy calculus, where we get twice the amount of economic output with less energy demand. That's pretty good. And that's really the trend you see in a lot of developed economies over time. So this is the U.S. picture for that same chart I showed you a minute ago. And you'll notice that generally across the top of most of those, they're trending down, except in the industrial area. And this is directly a result of the improved natural gas developments and access to natural gas liquids in the U.S. We have a very competitive economy, very competitive industrial base, and we see growing use of natural gas and gas liquids supporting both chemicals expansion as well as other industries. Ms. Forrester this morning had a chart talking about that and showed, well, or maybe it was John. I don't know, but they had a chart this morning. So this is that same chart turned sideways, and the chart on the right is our fuel mix, which is really the more interesting chart. The one thing I would say, transportation in the U.S. is about 30% of our mix and not 20% like in the rest of the world. But you'll notice that oil demand is declining in the U.S. This is one of the issues that we struggle with as we deal with balancing our refineries and getting the right crudes into those refineries for long-term economic performance of the refineries. We are able to export products, but getting the right mix there. Gas grows substantially in the power generation and industrial sectors. The U.S. gas market continues to be the largest gas market in the world throughout this, though China does become more significant. And you'll see some growth in nuclear and other renewables. So that's our overall mix. So we're trying to, I want to now talk about demand. And so what I've told you in about 10 charts is what the world looks like. So, you know, you got all that, right? Ready for the quiz? I realize I go through these fairly quickly, but in all fairness, here I'll back up. It's the trends that are important. It's the sort of important thematic messages about what's happening in the world. We can handle the questions in a minute where we get into some of the details. Power generation demand, it doesn't quite double globally, but it's up about 85%. But this is where we see a lot of efficiency because the fuel is only up 50%. The increase in natural gas in the overall power generation mix, where we see high efficiency combined cycle units coming in at 55, 60% efficiency, is really important. Coal does decrease from the large share it had at the beginning down to about 30%. Now, nuclear and renewables grow substantially. And this is part of both the mandates we see in a lot of developed economies, plus China's very aggressive nuclear program. And so I've got 2 or 3 ways to show this, so I'm not going to overwork this one. But the chart on the right shows energy demand difference, incremental energy demand between 2010 and 2040. So you'll notice the Asia Pacific bar is almost all up. They take a little bit of oil out. In North America, we take coal out of our mix and replace it with gas, nuclear, and renewable. Europe actually takes more fuel out and replaces it with renewable. If you're not aware of it, though, Germany has been through a significant experiment, which works well in some cases and others doesn't. They've introduced a lot of renewable power in their outlook, in their current power generation mix, and they're dealing with some significant balancing and system issues. And the other areas tend to grow, and they rely on gas as much as they can. So let's break it back to my group of countries and dynamics. So the OECD is down. I've showed you that. And really that's because of efficiency and power generation, more natural gas in there, renewables in there. And then China's overall mix doubles. India's power generation fuel triples. And the others grow substantially as well. Well, the OECD, we saw the US a minute ago, but this is the story. So our outlook since mid-2000s, we've had a climate policy framework in our outlook. We recognized at that time that the world governments were going to take action and deal with greenhouse gases. We had no idea what the policy was going to be, but we put in place a CO2 proxy cost in our models to adapt fuel mix and deal with that. And so we've had that in there for that time, and it goes out to 2040. When we added another 10 years to our outlook a few years ago, we introduced the developing economies. China and the other wealthier ones also have similar proxy costs at a lower level, but still have it. And that starts to change the energy mix. That's what's taking coal down in the mix and increasing natural gas and other non-carbon sources in the OECD. In China, gas grows into power. Nuclear grows. China should have about 200 gigawatts of installed nuclear capacity by about 2040. So India is going to be predominantly a coal user. Generally speaking, if you're a developing economy, coal is the most economic source of electricity, even if they don't have it and they have to import it. Now, China, India both have substantial coal resources, but India is a major importer of coal. And you can see China's coal use goes down. When you get to the key growth, a number of those economies have natural gas resources in country, and they're able to use those. Where not, they'll introduce coal. But some are building nuclear plants as well. And you see that in the Middle East, and you also see it in the rest of the world. So you do see a diversification of power mix depending upon each individual country's needs. Now, the general theme is natural gas captures a significant share of growing, about 35% of all the growth in fuel demand in the power generation sector goes to natural gas. So the US, and I know I've showed you a little bit of this, so I'm not going to spend long on here. Our electricity demand on the left grows about 20%. It's driven by a recovery in the industrial sector across the bottom in the dark blue, and a growth in the commercial businesses on the top of the bars. And that electricity demand growth translates into a fuel mix just like I showed on those other bars. So we don't need to go through it, but that's what's happening here in the US. And we think this gas demand in power gen represents the largest increase in gas demand in the US marketplace. I've mentioned renewables probably half a dozen times so far. Let's just talk about them for a minute. So wind and solar are the two primary renewables that are being used today to penetrate many of the developed economies. They tend to ignore the fact that a substantial amount of hydroelectric already exists. But wind and solar are growing. We add about 1,000 gigawatts of wind. Wow, that sounds like a big number. I don't know what does that mean? The US total installed power generation capacity is about 1,000 gigawatts. Now you couldn't replace it with 1,000 gigawatts of wind because the wind doesn't blow all the time and doesn't blow steady all the time. But it's that scale. That's how many power plants are being built when you talk about that globally. The solar is about 50-50. Big solar installations and rooftops, distributed type. And that's growing. Costs are coming down. And so we see penetration levels rising. Now, the world will get to about 11%. Now, this is of the electricity consumed. The United States will get up around 15%. European Union will be in the mid-20s. And then China and India both have big programs. These four groups represent the largest concentration of renewable penetration in the world. The primary issue with renewables, as I look at it, and when we walk into a room, we turn a light switch on. What do you expect to happen? Lights to go on. And if they don't, your first question is, who do I call? And it might be go check the breaker box, but that's not wrong. Then it's who do you call? And so what happens is to back up that renewable, you need reserve margin. And so existing reserve margins in the existing networks is providing that backup. Well, we already paid for that reserve margin. And so later, when we built a lot more renewables and other systems, we're going to have to add in additional reserve margin. And that is going to create some stranded capital that the consumer is going to have to pay for. And so there is a hidden cost in renewables. I'm not saying don't do renewables. That's a decision others are making. But if we do it, we need to understand that the full cost is a little bit more than people are advertising. So industrial demand, I think we're good. The industrial demand is a significant growth. Chemicals and heavy industry are the two big demand drivers for industrial demand. And this is important for global energy demand as well as in the U.S. The colors, the little pictures here. The only one I'm going to stop on is steel. Heavy industry is where the world makes steel. If you're going to build a city in Asia, you're going to build a city in China, you're going to build a city in Africa, you need steel. You need cement, you build roads, buildings, train stations, track, airports, all of that. That's one of the big drivers of energy demand around the world. The energy industry is fairly efficient and does grow, and agriculture plays a lot of role in the rest of industry. The chemical demand is the largest percent increase, because as we grow in income levels, we actually end up needing more chemical products because we can afford them. If you walk into a hospital now, other than the building, almost everything has got plastic on it. And if you buy a car, more and more percentage of the car have plastics. And so those materials are what is driving the increase in chemical demand. And you'll see it grows kind of across the board, even in the US there at the bottom. I'll just make a point. The green and red grow the most. Oil and natural gas are the primary feedstocks into this, and that's an important part of liquid and gas demand. And that second set of bars is gas liquid. And here in the U.S., because of the increase in tight oil, the associated gas that I think John mentioned earlier is an important source of growing ethane. And that's what's supporting all this chemical investment that we're hearing about in North America. Heavy industry we've talked about, and natural gas there in red is a primary growth source. It just about doubles and plays an important role going forward. Transportation. Now, in all fairness, our liquid fuels go into transportation, but natural gas is also starting to play an important role. And so I want to talk a bit about both. That's global liquid demand for transportation fuels. That's the U.S. Very different trends. The U.S. has historically been one of the largest markets for this, but over time that changes. Gasoline demand is trending down around the world because of efficiency. Our vehicles will about double. We'll go from 800 billion to about 800 million to 1.7 billion cars, and efficiency is going to double in that time period. And what you see in the U.S. is a significant decline in gasoline fuel for the U.S. You'll notice natural gas is starting to penetrate fairly significantly around the world, and there is some penetration in the U.S. I thought John did a nice job earlier of pointing out sort of the range of demand and the relative impact of it. It is growing, but where we have to replace infrastructure, it's very expensive. Where you have new infrastructure you can build, you can do it. China has the largest fleet of CNG buses right now, for example. And that's the kind of place where it's starting to penetrate. In many developing economies where they can get gas into transportation, they're using it to improve their air quality. A little bit about vehicles. And more of this is just because I know a lot of people always ask me the question, what about electric cars? So this is the U.S. vehicle fleet. And the solid green is the internal combustion engine that's in probably most of the cars we have out there. If you drove here in a hybrid, you'd be in that top blue part. Hybrid penetration is fairly low at this stage, and we really see continuing improvements in the internal combustion engine. This is the U.S. vehicle fleet, but if I put up another chart, it would be similar. And it's the boosted cars, the turbochargers are what you see coming into the market first. The chart on the right highlights that. You see the boosted green line? Up to about 15% sales in the last year or so. And what that is a turbocharged vehicle. That's the growth. That's the next most expensive technology the manufacturer can put in the car to achieve the efficiency they're trying to target. They'll move to hybrids when they penetrate and use all of those other technologies, like better gearing and transmissions, lightweighting, turbocharging, direct fuel injection, smaller engines, all of that. And then they'll move to hybridization where you get the other penetration. You see hybrids are selling at about 4%. Diesels really we don't think will penetrate in the US very heavily, and the electrics will take time because the battery portion is fairly expensive and there are issues around range and other anxiety from the vehicle. Not that some people aren't buying, not to say, because they are out there in the marketplace. And this is heavy duty transportation. This is diesel fuel. This is what's driving transportation fuel demand up. So this represents about a 70% growth in transportation demand, and it's really in the developing economies. And it is heavily diesel demand. And this is one of the things that's challenging refineries now, is we need more diesel than we need gasoline, and refineries are not necessarily configured to only produce one product or the other. And so we get into investment issues around doing that and managing that. And you'll see the natural gas penetration gets up under, I think it gets to about 10% of global transportation fuel. It's 8% in that range. So to summarize global demand, oil and gas are the two largest demand sources, supply sources in 2040. Now gas is third today and coal is higher, but our outlook because of the climate policies is that coal is going to grow and decline and come in just as modest growth. And oil and gas are going to represent somewhere around 58% of our energy mix going forward into 2040. Now, nuclear doubles, and I told you about China's program, and then also solar wind grow at about 8% per year and up substantially over that distance, but they're starting at a fairly small base. And the scale of the energy system is just staggering when you think about it. So because we've had in our framework, global CO2 policy framework, we actually end up with an emission profile that grows and then peaks and starts to decline. And this is a trend that we've identified over the last few years. You'll notice that the OECD is certainly going down, but also that China's energy-related CO2 emissions are also peaking and declining. And that's a result of policies, first, where they deal with air quality issues, and second, where they actually are going to deal with greenhouse gases. Now, if you look at this chart on the left, you would take away that it's the growth in global energy related emissions is the non-OECD, and that is true, but we need to remember the fact that the OECD economies, on a per capita basis, actually produce more emissions. Sorry. So we're about to get into supply. So now I've made you an expert on global energy demand. I've talked about the individual sectors, and so I want to talk about supply. I don't think you can start a conversation about supply without first talking about this chart. In today's world and what's happened in the last 5 years, with oil demand up, oil production in the U.S. up about 70%, and gas demand peaking up 25%, and continuing to grow substantial. It's a substantial testament to all the speakers earlier about what's been happening in the industry, the pace of industry development, the availability of resources, where they stack up in the world, the technology evolution. And I guess one thing I would say about technology is a hidden gem in a lot of this. And a lot of people think, oh, it just happened a little while ago and we put these two things together and voila. Well, the reality is it took decades of trial and error in the field, going back to earlier work to building those base technologies of horizontal drilling, the steering, as we heard earlier, the ability to hit that refrigerator. I don't really care what model. But the point is that's really the culmination of decades of evolution, and it's really probably just a stopping point before we keep moving on. But this industry has been amazing when you think about overall technology development. So this chart, I realize it's pretty busy, but it's actually pretty straightforward. The far left is production by the world. It's up about 60%. In our measure in the U.S., we think in terms of billions of cubic feet per day. The world gas market grows 200 billion cubic feet per day, plus some change. And so does production. The number one increase in that region is in North America. In the middle, it's how much of it is conventional and how much of it is unconventional. The first point I'd make is conventional captures, growth in conventional globally captures about 40% of that growth in demand. But the other 60% comes from unconventional. And by the end of our outlook, roughly 30% of the world's supply of gas will be unconventional. And it won't all be in North America. And if you look at the far right, shale probably is the largest share, but we do see a lot of varieties of unconventional production, and they do grow. And it really depends on where you are. North America, 85% of our production by 2040 will be from unconventional sources. This chart, again, a little busy, but actually pretty straightforward. The dashed lines are demand. The two color bars represent production. The lighter bar is the unconventional, what I just showed you in the other one. And what you see is as we get past 2020, North America will move into a net export position. This was I think John referenced that earlier in the presentation. Now, as you look across the page, you'll see, well, Latin America sort of stays in balance. And Africa, it grows demand and supply so it can contribute. Europe is short and needs to import. Russia-Caspian region will be an exporter. The Middle East continues to export, but demand grows. And Asia-Pacific has this huge increase in demand and supply, and this demand increase represents half of the global increase in gas demand, about 100 billion cubic feet per day, larger than today's gas market. Now, when I say net exports and need to export, what we're really talking about here is these are regions that can contribute to or draw on the global balance of energy. And so in the case of gas, you transport it in one of two ways. You buy an interregional pipeline that has a reasonable limit in distance, or LNG. So this is the chart that shows the LNG and pipeline. And what you see, now, what you don't see is where it's exported from. I've already sliced that off. And so the assumption here is North America is exporting natural gas. And then over time, Europe imports LNG and pipeline gas. The lighter yellow is pipelines. And if you look in Asia, probably half of that gas demand, let's see, 80% of the imports in Asia go by LNG. And that's really what the conversation is about exporting LNG out of any part of the world. The LNG business is large. As you heard in the introduction, I was involved in it for a decade. I like to point out that was before it was cool. We in the US didn't actually know much about it then, but some parts of the world, Japan and Korea and others did. But it triples, and you'll notice that increase is dominated by the red in the Asia Pacific. And you'll notice on the right, there's actually growth across all three regions, particularly the Atlantic Basin and the Pacific Basin. And they represent important supplies. Now, an Atlantic Basin supply could leave the Gulf of Mexico and go through the Panama Canal and move into the Pacific. So a couple of charts on oil, and we'll wrap up and we'll get to some questions. And oil demand is up just under 30%, and oil supplies grow to meet that. And a lot of technology is involved in producing incremental liquid supplies, just like is involved in producing incremental gas supplies. Biofuels have been discussed for a couple decades. They're in the marketplace. They're mandated. They don't grow very much. They're expensive. They're not as fuel replacements. We just don't think they're competitive economically. And there are some challenges to meet some of the targets for the more advanced biofuels. Gas liquids are growing because of the increase in gas use, gas production. And that goes right back to unconventional, a lot of that growth. Tight oil, well, we're close to the epicenter in the country around this. That's what we're talking about today. Tight oil is a major growth area for the world, but still, it's only a relatively small portion when you look at the absolute scale of demand. Oil sands in Canada, and ultimately some in Latin America. Deep water, important supplies, but still we rely heavily on conventional crude and condensate. And when you look at that conventional crude and condensate, you realize a lot of investment is needed in that. Around the world, we're going to be developing conventional resources, and those will continue to demand investment. And that's really what we're talking about here to meet overall global supplies. The 4 bars on the right represent snapshots of resources that were estimates between the USGS and the International Energy Agency. And what they show is that over about a 30-year period, we've had a very significant change in resource. Now, that's because of better technology to know where they are, better technology to develop them economically, better technology to develop them and access them, period. And that's really a pretty stunning testament to the evolution of the industry and the many participants in the industry that support it. So I'm going to do the same chart I just did on gas. So that's liquid demand for North America by decade, and that's a buildup of the supplies. And tight oil and oil sands and gas liquids play an important part. And by the time we get to the top, we believe that sometime in the middle of our outlook, we would actually have, we would be in a net export position for liquids out of the U.S., out of North America, perhaps the U.S. But the point here is, again, this is not a definition of trade or isolation. This is a definition of what's the right economic balance. But it means that globally on a balanced network, we don't expect to see the North American continent draw on global oil supplies to balance. It'll be able to balance and then trade as it makes economic sense, whether that's products or otherwise. So Latin America grows and does eventually outgrow its demand level, so it is able to contribute to the global balance. Deep water is important there. Africa actually supply doesn't grow, but demand does, to where there's less and less balance long term. Now there's a bit of a repeat in this story. Europe is an importer, even though demand is going down. Remember, the OECD liquid demand is generally declining. And then if you look at the Middle East, and Russia, Caspian, these are 2 major exporters, and the Middle East does increase capacity, but so does demand. And then you have really, in this case, compared to gas, basically a flat production outlook, even with investment in Asia Pacific and a substantial increase in liquid demand. So it really, if you step back, what you see is the same thing. Asia Pacific and European area are going to be needing to import more and more liquids to balance, and the rest of the world will fit into that as part of a network. So 2 charts to finish. So this is the global energy mix over time, just like that demand and who was playing earlier. We looked at this chart back to 1850, and you can see a lot of interesting trends, but this one I think makes the point. In the 60 years represented here, oil and gas are going to continue to play an important role. 60% of the energy mix-ish, 58%. Coal will peak and decline because of policies to address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Other renewables, hydro, wind and solar, nuclear are going to grow as an interest in moving in low carbon and no carbon sources. And so overall, we're going to see this continued transition in the energy mix. This is an important statement, but we have to remember it takes decades, even generations, to really radically change this. You go back to when coal was introduced to support steam engines, and it took 4 decades in the U.S. for it to become the largest energy source. So that concludes the charts. I know we're going to go into questions. I would leave you with a few thoughts, though. Energy demand is up significantly to support rising income and an improving standard of living around the world. There are people out there, and I think Ms. Forster said it very well this morning, that want the same kind of things. They want to have lights, they want to be able to study at night, they want their children to do well, and there are people at different levels of development that all want to move up. And so more energy is going to be required for that. Technology is probably one of the biggest sources of improved energy supply, but also efficiency. And efficiency is probably one of our biggest energy types. And so the Energy Outlook reference here, the ExxonMobil EnergyOutlook.com, you go to that website, you can download the Energy Outlook, the U.S. Energy Outlook, the China Energy Outlook, and so those are all available there. And also, if you have a tablet and you want to download the app either from the App Store or the Android Google Play, you can download our Energy Outlook, and when you're online, it's an interactive version. So, but I didn't bring 260-page books in the interest to save the trees. So I think with that, we're gonna go into some questions.